There was grief at the parting, and I was grieved to behold it.
Alas, I had heart only for myself,
said Gimli.
Nay, I will not speak of that journey.
He fell silent. But Pippin and Merry were so eager for news that at last Legolas said,
I will tell you enough for your peace, for I felt not the horror, and I feared not the shadows of men, powerless and frail as I deemed them.
Swiftly then he told of the haunted road under the mountain, and the dark tryst at Erech, and the great ride thence, 90 leagues and 3, to Pelargir on Anduin.
4 days and nights and on into a 5th we rode from the Blackstone,
he said.
And lo, in the darkness of Mordor my hope rose, for in that gloom the shadow host seemed to grow stronger and more terrible to look upon. Some I saw riding, some striding, yet all moving with the same great speed. Silent they were, but there was a gleam in their eyes. In the uplands of Lamedon they overtook our horses, and swept round us, and would have passed by us if Aragorn had not forbidden them. At his command they fell back. Even the shades of men are obedient to his will, I thought. 1 day of light we rode, and then came the day without dawn. And still we rode on, and Ciril and Ringlu we crossed, and on the 3rd day we came to Linhir above the mouth of Gilrain. And there the men of Lamedon contested the fords with fell folk of Umbar and Harad, who had sailed up the river. But defenders and foes alike gave up the battle and fled when we came, crying out that the king of the dead was upon them. Only Angbor, lord of Lamedon, had the heart to abide us, and Aragorn bade him gather his folk and come behind, if they dared, when the grey host had passed.
And Pelargir, the heir of Isildur, will have need of you,
he said. Thus we crossed over Gilrain, driving the allies of Mordor in rout before us, and then we rested a while. But soon Aragorn arose, saying, Lo! Already Minas Tirith is assailed. I fear that it will fall ere we come to its aid. So we mounted again before the night, and passed and went on with all speed that our horses could endure over the plains of Lebanon.
Legolas paused and sighed, and turning his eyes southward softly, he sang,
Silver flow the streams of Kelos to Erui, in the green fields of Lebanon. Tall grows the grass there, in the wind from the sea. The white lilies sway, and the golden bells are shaken of Malos and Alfirin, in the green fields of Lebanon, in the wind from the sea. Green are those fields in the songs of my people, but they were dark then, grey wastes in the blackness before us, and over the wide land, trampling unheeded the grass and the flowers, we hunted our foes through a day and a night until we came at the bitter end to the great river, at last. Then I thought in my heart that we drew near the sea, for wide was the water in the darkness, and sea-birds innumerable cried on its shores, Alas for the wailing of the gulls! Did not the lady tell me to beware of them? And now I cannot forget them.
For my part I heeded a lot,
said Gimli.
For we came then at last upon the battle in earnest. There at Pelargir lay the main fleet of Umbar, 50 great ships and smaller vessels beyond count. Many of those that were pursued and reached the havens before us, and brought their fear with them, and some of the ships had put off, seeking to escape down the river or to reach the far shore. And many of the smaller craft were ablaze, but the Haradrim, being now driven to the brink, turned that bay. And they were fierce in despair, and they laughed when they looked at us, for they were a great army still. But Aragorn halted and cried with a great voice,
Now come! By the black stone I call you!
And suddenly the shadow host that had hung back at the last came up like a great tide, sweeping all away before it. Faint cries I heard, and dim horns blowing, and a murmur of the countless far voices. It was like the echo of some forgotten battle in the dark years long ago. Pale swords were drawn, but I know not whether their blades could still bite, for the dead needed no longer any weapon but fear. None would withstand them. To every ship they came that was drawn up, and then they passed over the waters to those that were anchored, and all the mariners were filled with a madness of terror, and leapt overboard save the slaves chained to the oars. Reckless we rowed among our fleeting foes, driving them like leaves until we came to the shore. And then to each of the great ships that remained, Aragorn sent one of the Dunedain, and they confronted the captives that were abroad, and bade them put aside fear and be free. Ere the dark day ended, none of the enemy were left to resist us. All were drowned, or were flying south in the hope to find their own lands upon foot. Strange and wonderful I thought it, that the designs of Mordor should be overthrown by such wraiths of fear and darkness. With its own weapons was it worsted.
Strange indeed, said Legolas. In that hour I looked on Aragorn, and thought how great and terrible a lord he might have become in the strength of his will, had he taken the ring to himself. Not for naught does Mordor fear him, but nobler is his spirit than the understanding of Sauron. For is he not of the child of Luthien? Never shall that line fail, though the years may lengthen beyond count.
Beyond the eyes of the dwarves are such
Said Gimli.
But mighty indeed was Aragorn that day. Lo, all the Black Fleet was in his hands, and he chose the greatest ship to be his own, and he went up into it. Then he let sound the great concourse of trumpets taken from the enemy, and the shadow host withdrew to the shore. There they stood, silent, hardly to be seen save for a red gleam in their eyes that caught the glare of the ships that were burning. And Aragorn spoke in a loud voice to the dead men, crying,
Hear now the words of the heir of Isildur. Your oath is fulfilled. Go back, and trouble not the valleys ever again. Depart, and be at rest.
And thereupon the king of the dead stood out before the host, and broke his spear and cast it down. Then he bowed low, and turned away, and swiftly the whole grey host threw off, and vanished like a mist that is driven back by a sudden wind. And it seemed to me that I awoke from a dream. That night we rested while others laboured, for there were many captives set free, and many slaves released who had been folk of Gondor taken in raids. And soon also there was a great gathering of men out of Lebanon and the Aethir. And Angbor of Lamadon came up with all the horsemen that he could muster. Now that the fear of the dead was removed, they came to aid us and to look on the heir of Isildur, for the rumour of that name had run like fire in the dark. And that is near the end of our tale. For during that evening and night many ships were made ready and manned, and in the morning the fleet set forth. Long past it now seems, yet it was but the morn of the day ere yesterday, the 6th since we rode from Dunharrow, but still Aragorn was driven by fear that time was too short.
It is 40 leagues and 2 from Pelargir to the landings at the Harland, he said. Yet to the Harland we must come tomorrow, or fail utterly.
The oars were now wielded by free men, and manfully they laboured. Yet slowly we passed up the great river, and we strove against its stream, and though that is not swift down in the south, we had no help of wind. Heavy would my heart have been for all the victory at the havens, if Legolas had not laughed suddenly.
Fear Durin son,
He said,
for thus it is spoken. Oft hope is born when all is forlorn.
but what hope we saw from afar we could not tell. When night came, it did but deepen the darkness, and our hearts were hot. For away in the north we saw a red glow under the cloud, and Aragorn said,
Minas Tirith is burning.
But at midnight hope was indeed born anew. Sea-crafty men of the Aethir gazing southward spoke of a change coming with a fresh wind from the sea. Long ere the day the masted ships hoisted sail, and our speed grew until dawn whitened the foam at our prows. And so it was, as you know, that we came in the 3rd hour of the morning with the fair wind and the sun unveiled, and we unfurled the great standard in battle. And a great hour, whatever may come after.
Follow what may. Great deeds are not lessons in worth, said Legolas. Great deed was the riding of the paths of the dead, and great it shall remain, though none be left in Gondor to sing of it in the days that are to come.
And that may well befall,
said Gimli.
for the faces of Aragorn and Gandalf are grave. Much I wonder what counsels they are talking in the tents there below. For my part, like Merry, I wish that with our victory the war was now over. Yet whatever is still to do, I hope to have a part in it, for the honour of the folk of the Lonely Mountain.
And I for the folk of the Great Wood, said Legolas, and for the love of the Lord of the White Tree. Then the companions fell silent. But a while they sat there in the high place, each busy with their own thoughts, while their captains debated. When the Prince Imrahil had parted from Legolas and Gimli, at once he sent for Éomer, and went down with him from the city, and they came to the tents of Aragorn that was set up on the field, not far from the place where King Theoden had fallen. And there they took counsel together, with Gandalf and Aragorn and the sons of Elrond.
My lords,
Said Gandalf.
listen to the words of the Steward of Gondor before he died. You may triumph on the fields of the Pelennor for a day, but against the power that has now arisen there is no victory. I do not bid you despair, as he did, but to ponder the truth in these words. The stones of seeing do not lie, and not even the Lord of Barad-dûr can make them do so. He can, maybe, by his will choose what things shall be seen by weaker minds, or cause them to mistake the meaning of what they see. Nonetheless, it cannot be doubted that when Denethor saw great forces arrayed against him in Mordor, and more still being gathered, he saw that which truly is. Hardly has our strength sufficed to beat off the first great assault. The next will be greater. This war, then, is without final hope, as Denethor perceived. Victory cannot be achieved by arms. Whether you sit here to endure siege after siege, or march out to be overwhelmed beyond the river, you have only a choice of evils. And prudence would counsel you to strengthen such strong places as you have, and there await the onset. For so shall the time before your end be made a little longer.
Then you would have us retreat to Minas Tirith or Dol Amroth or to Dunharrow, and there sit like children on sandcastles when the tide is flowing? Said Imrahil.
That would be no new counsel,
Said Gandalf.
Have you not done this and a little more in all the days of Denethor? But no, I said this would be prudent. I do not counsel prudence. I said victory could not be achieved by arms. I still hope for victory, but not by arms. For into the midst of all these policies comes the Ring of Power, the foundation of Barad-dûr, and the hope of Sauron. Concerning this thing, my lords, you now all know enough for the understanding of our plight, and of Sauron's. If he regains it, your valor is vain, and his victory will be swift and complete. So complete that none can foresee the end of it while this world lasts. If it is destroyed, then he will fall, and his fall will be so low that none can foresee his rising ever again. For he will lose the best part of the strength that was native to him in his beginning. And all that was made or begun with that power will crumble, and he will be maimed forever, becoming a mere spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows, but cannot again grow or take shape. And so a great evil of this world will be removed. Other evils there are and may come, for Sauron is himself but a servant or emissary. Yet it is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule. Now, Sauron knows all this, and he knows that this precious thing which he lost has been found again. But he does not yet know where it is, or so we hope, and therefore he is now in great doubt. For if we have found this thing, there are some among us with strength enough to wield it. That too he knows. For do I not guess rightly, Aragorn, that you have shown yourself to him in the Stone of Orthanc?
I did so ere I rode from the Hornburg, answered Aragorn. I deemed that a time was ripe, and that the stone had come to me for just such a purpose. It was then 10 days since the ring-bearer went east from Rauros, and the Eye of Sauron, I thought, should be drawn out from his own land. Too seldom has he been challenged since he returned to his tower. Though if I had foreseen how swift would be his onset in answer, maybe I should not have dared to show myself. Bare time was given me to come to your aid.
How is this?
Asked Éomer.
Why would he think it not vain to assail us if we have it? He is not yet sure,
said Gandalf.
And he has not built up his power by waiting until his enemies are secure. Also, we could not learn how to wield the full power all in a day. Indeed, it can be used only by one master alone, not by many. and he will look for a time of strife, ere one of the great among us makes himself master and puts down the others. In that time the ring might aid him, if he were sudden. He is watching. He sees much and hears much. His Nazgûl are still abroad. They passed over this field ere the sunrise, though the few of the weary and sleeping were aware of them. He studies the signs. The sword that robbed him of his treasure remade, the winds of fortune turning in our favor, and the defeat unlooked for of his first assault, the fall of his great captain. His doubt will be growing, even as we speak here. His eye is now straining towards us, blind almost to all else that is moving. So we must keep it. Therein lies all our hope. This, then, is my counsel. We have not the ring. In wisdom or great folly, it has been sent away to be destroyed, lest it destroy us. Without it, we cannot by force defeat his force, but we must at all costs keep his eye from his true peril. We cannot achieve victory by arms, but by arms we can give the ring-bearer his only chance, frail though it be. As Aragorn has begun, so we must go on. We must push Sauron to his last throw. We must call out his hidden strength, so that he shall empty his land. We must march out to meet him at once. We must make ourselves the bait, though his jaws should close on us. He will take that bait in hope and in greed, for he will think that in such rashness he sees the pride of the new Ring Lord, and he will say, "So, he pushes out his neck too soon and too far. Let him come on, and behold, I will have him a trap from which he cannot escape. There I will crush him, and what he has taken in his insolence shall be mine again forever." We must walk open-eyed into that trap with courage, but small hope for ourselves. For, my lords, it may well prove that we ourselves shall perish utterly in a black battle, far from the living lands, so that even if Barad-dûr be thrown down, we shall not live to see a new age. But this I deem is our duty, and better so than to perish nonetheless, as we surely shall if we sit here, and know as we die that no new age shall be.
They were silent for a while. At length Aragorn spoke.
As I have begun, so I will go on. We come now to the very brink, where hope and despair are akin. To waver is to fall. Let none now reject the counsels of Gandalf, whose long labours against Sauron come at last to their test. But for him, all would long ago have been lost. Nonetheless, I do not yet claim to command any man. Let others choose as they will.
Then said Elrohir,
Although we brought this very counsel, we will not turn back.
said Éomer.
This I know, and it is enough. That as my friend, Aragorn, succoured me and my people, so I will aid him when he calls. I will go.
As for me, said Imrahil, the Lord Aragorn I hold to be my liege lord, whether he claim it or no. His wish is to me a command. I will go also. Yet for a while I stand in the place of the steward of Gondor, and it is mine to think the first of its people. To prudence some heed must still be given, for we must prepare against all chances, good as well as evil. Now it may be that we shall triumph, and while there is any hope of this, Gondor must be protected. I would not have us return with victory to a city in ruins and a land ravaged behind us. And yet we learn from the Rohirrim that there is an army still unfought upon our northern flank.
That is true,
said Gandalf.
I do not counsel you to leave the city all unmanned. Indeed, the force that we lead east need not be great enough for any assault in earnest upon Mordor, so long as it be great enough to challenge battle. And it must move soon. Therefore I ask the captains, what force could we muster and lead out in 2 days' time at the latest? And they must be hardy men that go willingly, knowing their peril.
All are weary, and very many have wounds, light or grievous, said Éomer, and we have suffered much loss of our horses, and that is ill to bear. If we must ride soon, then I cannot hope to lead even 2,000, and yet leave as many for the defense of the city. We have not only to reckon with those who fought on this field, said Aragorn. New strength is on the way from the southern fiefs, now that the coasts have been rid. 4,000 I sent marching from Pelargir through Lossarnach 2 days ago, and Angbor the Fearless rides before them. If we set out in 2 days more, they will draw nigh ere we depart. Moreover, many were bidden to follow me up the river in any craft they could gather, and with this wind they will soon be at hand. Indeed, several ships have already come to the Harland. I judge that we could lead out 7,000 of horse and foot, and yet leave the city in better defense than it was when the assault began. The gate is destroyed, said Imrahil, and where now is the skill to rebuild it and set it up anew? In Erebor, in the kingdom of Dain, there is such skill, said Aragorn. And if all our hopes do not perish, then in time I will send Gimli, Gloin's son, to ask for rights of the mountain. But men are better than gates, and no gate will endure against our enemy if men desert it. This then was the end of the debate of the lords, that they should set forth on the second morning from that day with 7,000, if these might be found, and the great part of this force should be on foot, because of the evil lands to which they would go. Aragorn should find some 2,000 of those that he had gathered to him in the south, but Imrahil should find 3,500, and Éomer 5,000 of the Rohirrim, who were unhorsed but themselves war-worthy, and he himself should lead 500 of his best riders on horse, and another company of 500 horses there should be, among which should ride the sons of Elrond, with the Dunedain, and the knights of Dol Amroth. All told 6,000 foot and 1,000 horse. But the main strength of the Rohirrim that remained horse and able to fight, some 3,000 under the command of Elfhelm, should waylay the west road against the enemy that was in Anúrion. And at once, swift riders were sent out to gather what news they could northwards, and eastwards from Osgiliath and the road to Minas Morgul. And when they had reckoned up all their strength and taken thought of their journeys they should make and the roads they should choose, Imrahil suddenly laughed aloud. Surely, he cried, this is the greatest jest in all the history of Gondor. That we should ride with 7,000, scarce as many as the vanguard of its army in the days of its power, to assault the mountains and the impenetrable gate of the Black Land. So might a child threaten a mail-clad knight with the bows and green willow. If the Dark Lord knows as much as you say, Mithrandir, will he not rather smile than fear, and with his little finger crush us like a fly that tries to sting it?
No, he will try to trap the fly and take the sting,
said Gandalf.
And there are names among us that are worth more than 1,000 mail-clad knights apiece. No, he will not smile.
Neither shall we, said Aragorn. If this be jest, then it is too bitter for laughter. Nay, it is the last move in a great jeopardy, and for one side or the other, it will bring the end of the game. Then he drew Andúril and held it up glittering in the sun. You shall not be sheathed again until the last battle is fought, he said. Two days later, the army of the West was all assembled on the Pelennor. The host of orcs and Easterlings had turned back out of Anúrion, but harried and scattered by the Rohirrim they had broken and fled with little fighting towards Caradhras. And with that threat destroyed, and a new strength arriving out of the south of the city, was as well manned as might be. Scouts reported that no enemies remained upon the roads east as far as the crossroads of the fallen king. All now was ready for the last throw. Legolas and Gimli were to ride again together in the company of Aragorn and Gandalf, who went in the van with the Dunedain and the sons of Elrond. But Merry, to his shame, was not to go with them.
You are not fit for such a journey,
Said Aragorn, but do not be ashamed. If you do no more in this war, you have already earned great honor. Peregrine shall go and represent the Shire folk, and do not grudge him his chance of peril. Though he has done as well as his fortune allowed him, he has yet to match your deed. But in truth, all now are in like danger, though it may be our part to find bitter end before the gate of Mordor. If we do so, then you will come also to a last stand, either here or wherever the black tide overtakes you. Farewell. And so despondently Merry now stood and watched the mustering of the army. Birgil was with him, and he also was downcast, for his father was to march leading the company of the men of the city. He could not rejoin the guard until his case was judged. In that same company, Pippin was also to go as a soldier of Gondor. Merry could see him not far off, a small but upright figure among the tall men of Minas Tirith. At last the trumpets rang, and the army began to move. Troop by troop, and company by company, they wheeled and went off eastward. And long after they had passed away out of sight down the great road to the causeway, Merry stood there. The last glint of the morning sun on spear and helm twinkled and was lost. And still he remained with bowed head and heavy heart, feeling friendless and alone. Everyone that he cared for had gone away into the gloom that hung over the distant eastern sky, and little hope at all was left in his heart that he would ever see any of them again. As if recalled by his mood of despair, the pain in his arm returned, and he felt weak and old, and the sunlight seemed thin. He was roused by the torch of Birgil's hand.
Come, Master Perian.
Said the lad.
You are still in pain, I see. I will help you back to the healers. But do not fear, they will come back. The men of Minas Tirith will never be overcome. And now they have the Lord Elfstone, and Beregond of the Guard too.
Ere noon the army came to Osgiliath. There all the workers and craftsmen that could be spared were busy. Some were strengthening the ferries and boat bridges that the enemy had made and in part destroyed when they fled. Some gathered stores and booty, and others on the eastern side across the river were throwing up hasty works of defense. The vanguard passed on through the ruins of old Gondor, and over the wide river, and on up the long straight road that in the high days had been made to run from the fair Tower of the Sun to the tall Tower of the Moon, which now was Minas Morgul, in its accursed vale. 5 miles beyond Osgiliath they halted, ending their first day's march. But the horsemen pressed on, and ere evening they came to the crossroads and the great ring of trees, and all was silent. No sign of an enemy had they seen, no cry or call had been heard, no shaft had sped from rock or thicket by the way. Yet ever as they went forward, they felt the watchfulness of the land increase. Tree and stone, blade and leaf were listening. The darkness had been dispelled, and far away westwards sunset on the vale of Anduin and the white peaks of the mountains blushed in the blue air. But a shadow and gloom brooded upon the Efelduath. Then Aragorn set trumpeteers at each of the 4 roads that ran into the ring of trees, and they blew a great fanfare, and the heralds cried aloud,
The lords of Gondor have returned, and all this land that is theirs they take back.
The hideous orc head that was set upon the carven figure was cast down and broken in pieces, and the old king's head was raised and set in its place once more, still crowned with white and golden flowers. And men laboured to wash and pare away the foul scrawls that orcs had put upon the stone. Now in their debate, some had counselled that Minas Morgul should first be assailed, and if they might take it, it should be utterly destroyed.
And maybe
Said Imrahil.
the road that leads thence to pass above will prove it upon the Dark Lord and his northern gate.
No.
But against this Gandalf had spoken urgently, because of the evil that dwelt in the valley, where the minds of living men would turn into madness and horror, and because also of the news that Faramir had brought. For if the ring-bearer had indeed attempted that way, then above all they should not draw the eye of Mordor thither. So the next day when the main host came up, they set a strong guard upon the crossroads to make some defence, if Mordor should send a force over the Morgul Pass, or should bring more men up from the south. For that guard they chose mostly archers who knew the ways of Ithilien, and would lie hid in the woods and slopes about the meeting of the ways. But Gandalf and Aragorn rode with the vanguard to the entrance of Morgul Vale and looked on the evil city. It was dark and lifeless, for the orcs and lesser creatures of Mordor that had dwelt there had been destroyed in battle, and the Nazgul were abroad. Yet the air of the valley was heavy with fear and enmity. Then they broke the evil bridge and set red flames in the noisome fields and departed. The day after, being the third day since they set out from Minas Tirith, the army began its northward march along the road. It was some 100 miles by the way of the crossroads to the Morannon, and what might befall them before they came so far, none knew. They went openly but hopefully, with mounted scouts before them on the road and others on foot upon either side, especially on the eastward flank. For there lay dark thickets in a tumbled land of rocky gills and crags, behind which the long grim slopes of the Ethelduath clambered up. The weather of the world remained fair, and the wind held in the west, but nothing could waft away the glooms and the sad mists that clung about the mountains of shadow. And behind them, at whiles, great smokes would arise and hover in the upper winds. Ever and anon, Gandalf let blow the trumpets, and the heralds would cry,
Let all leave this land or yield them up!
but Imrahil said,
Say not the lords of Gondor. Say the King Elessar, for that is true, even though he has not yet sat upon the throne, and it will give the enemy more thought if the heralds use that name.
And thereafter, thrice a day the heralds proclaimed the coming of the King Elessar. But none answered the challenge. Nonetheless, though they marched in seeming peace, the hearts of all the army from the highest to the lowest were downcast, and with every mile that they went north, foreboding of evil grew heavier on them. It was near the end of the second day of their march from the crossroads that they first met any offer of battle. For a strong force of orcs and Easterlings attempted to take their leading companies in an ambush, and that was in the very place where Faramir had waylaid the men of Harad, and the road went in a deep cutting through an outthrust of the eastward hills. But the captains of the west were well warned by their scouts, skilled men from Heneth-Anun led by Mablung. And so the ambush was itself trapped, for horsemen went wide about westward and came up on the flank of the enemy from behind, and they were destroyed or driven east into the hills. But the victory did little to enhearten the captains.
It is but a feint,
Said Aragorn.
and its chief purpose, I deem, was rather to draw us on by a false guess of our enemy's weakness than to do us much hurt yet.
And from that evening onward, the Nazgul came and followed every move of the army. They still flew high and out of sight of all save Legolas, and yet their presence could be felt, as a deepening of shadow and a dimming of the sun. And though the ring-wraiths did not yet stoop low upon their foes and were silent, uttering no cry, the dread of them could not be shaken off. So time and the hopeless journey wore away. Upon the 4th day from the crossroads and the 6th from Minas Tirith they came at last to the end of the living lands, and began to pass into the desolation that lay before the gates of the pass of Cirith Gorgor, and they could descry the marshes and the desert that stretched north and west to the Emin Muil. So desolate were those places and so deep the horror that lay on them that some of the host were unmanned, and they could neither walk nor ride further north. Aragorn looked at them, and there was pity in his eyes rather than wrath. For these were young men of Rohan, from Westfold far away, or husbandmen from Losanach, and to them Mordor had been from childhood a name of evil, and yet unreal, a legend that had no part in their simple life. And now they walked like men in a hideous dream made true, and they understood not this war, nor why fate should lead them to such a pass.
Go,
said Aragorn.
but keep what honor you may, and do not run. And there is a task which you may attempt, and so be not wholly ashamed. Take your way southwest till you come to Cairandros, and if that is still held by enemies, as we think, then retake it, if you can, and hold it to the last in defense of Gondor and Rohan.
Then some, being ashamed by his mercy, overcame their fear and went on. And the others took new hope, hearing a manful deed within their measure that they could turn to, and they departed. And so, since many men had already been left at the crossroads, it was with less than 6,000 that the captains of the West came at last to challenge the Black Gate and the might of Mordor. They advanced now slowly, expecting at every hour some answer to their challenge, and they drew together, since it was but a waste of men to send out scouts or small parties from the main host. At nightfall of the 5th day of the march from Morgul Vale, they made their last camp, and set fires about it of such dead wood and heath as they could find. They passed the hours of night in wakefulness, and they were aware of many things half seen, that walked and prowled all about them. And they heard the howling of wolves. The wind had died, and all the air seemed still. They could see little, for though it was cloudless and the waxing moon was 4 nights old, there were smokes and fumes that rose out of the earth, and the white crescent was shrouded in the mists of Mordor. It grew cold. As morning came, the wind began to stir again, but now it came from the north, and soon it freshened to a rising breeze. All the night walkers were gone, and the land seemed empty. North, amid their noisome pits, lay the first of the great heaps and hills of slag and broken rock and blasted earth. The vomit of the maggot folk of Mordor. But south, and now near, loomed the great rampart of Cirith Gorgor, and the Black Gate amidmost, and the 2 towers of the Teeth, tall and dark upon either side. For in their last march the captains had turned away from the old road as it bent east, and avoided the peril of the lurking hills, and so now they were approaching the Morannon from the northwest, even as Frodo had done. The 2 vast iron doors of the Black Gate under its frowning arch were fast closed. Upon the battlement nothing could be seen. All was silent but watchful. They were come to the last end of their folly, and stood forlorn and chill in the grey light of early day before towers and walls which their army could not assault with hope, not even if it had brought thither engines of great power, and the enemy had no more force than would suffice for the manning of the gate and wall alone. Yet they knew that all the hills and rocks about the Morannon were filled with hidden foes, and the shadowy defile beyond was bored and tunneled by teeming broods of evil things. And as they stood, they saw the Nazgul gathered together, hovering above the towers of the Teeth like vultures. And they knew that they were watched, but still the enemy made no sign. No choice was left but to play their part to its end. Therefore Aragorn now set the host in such array as could be best contrived, and they were drawn up on 2 great hills of blasted stone and earth that orcs had piled in years of labour. Before them, towards Mordor, lay like a moat a great mire of reeking mud and foul-smelling pools. When all was ordered, the captains rode forth towards the Black Gate with a great guard of horsemen, and the banner and heralds and trumpeteers. There was Gandalf as chief herald, and Aragorn with the sons of Elrond, and Éomer of Rohan, and Imrahil, and Legolas and Gimli and Peregrine were bidden to go also. so that all enemies of Mordor should have a witness. They came within cry of the Morannon, and unfurled their banner, and blew upon their trumpets, and the heralds stood out and sent their voices up over the battlefield of Mordor.
Come forth!
They cried,
Let the lords of the Black Land come forth! Justice shall be done upon him, for wrongfully has he made war upon Gondor, and wrested his lands. Therefore King of Gondor demands that he should atone for his evils, and depart then forever! Come forth!
There was a long silence. And from a wall and gate no cry or sound was heard in answer. But Sauron had already laid his plans, and he had a mind first to play these mice cruelly before he struck to kill. So it was, even as the captains were about to turn away, the silence was broken suddenly. There came a long rolling of great drums like thunder in the mountains, and then a braying of horns that shook the very stones and stunned men's ears. And thereupon the middle door of the black gate was thrown open with a great clang, and out of it there came an embassy from the Dark Tower. At its head there rode a tall, evil shape, mounted upon a black horse, if horse it was, for it was huge and hideous. And its face was a frightful mask, more like a skull than a living head, and in the sockets of its eyes and its nostrils there burned a flame. The rider was robed all in black, and black was his lofty helm. Yet this was no ringwraith, but a living man. The lieutenant of the Tower of Barad-dûr he was, and his name is remembered in no tale, for he himself had forgotten it. And he said,
I am the mouth of Sauron.
But it is told that he was a renegade, who came of the race of those that are named the Black Númenóreans. For they established their dwellings in Middle-earth during the years of Sauron's domination, and they worshipped him, being enamored of evil knowledge. And he entered the service of the Dark Tower when it first rose again, and because of his cunning, he grew ever higher in the Lord's favor. And he learned great sorcery, and knew much of the mind of Sauron, and he was more cruel than any orc. He it was that now rode out, and with him came only a small company of black-harnessed soldiery, and a single banner, black, but bearing on it in red the evil eye. Now halting a few paces before the captains of the West, he looked them up and down, and laughed.
Is there anyone in this rout with authority to treat with me?
He asked.
Or indeed with which to understand me? Not thou, at least.
He mocked, turning to Aragorn with scorn.
It needs more to make a king than a piece of elvish glass, or a rabble such as this. Why, any brigand of the hills can show as good a following.
Aragorn said naught in answer, but he took the other's eye and held it, and for a moment they strove thus. But soon, though Aragorn did not stir or move hand to weapon, the other quailed, and gave back as if menaced with the blow.
I am herald and ambassador, and may not be assailed,
he cried.
As such laws hold,
Said Gandalf.
it is also the custom of ambassadors to use less insolence. But no one has threatened you. You have naught to fear from us, until your errand is done. But unless your master has come to new wisdom, then with all his servants you will be in great peril.
So,
Said the messenger.
then thou art the spokesman, old grey beard. Have we not heard of thee at whiles, and of thy wanderings, ever hatching plots and mischief at a safe distance? But this time thou hast stuck out thy nose too far, Master Gandalf. And thou shalt see what comes to him who sets his foolish webs before the feet of Sauron the Great. I have tokens that I was bidden to show to thee. To thee in special, if thou shouldst dare to come.
He signed to one of his guards, and he came forward, bearing a bundle swathed in black cloths. The messenger put these aside, and there, to the wonder and dismay of all the captains, he held up first the short sword that Sam had carried, and next a grey cloak with an elven brooch, and last, the coat of mithril mail that Frodo had worn wrapped in his tattered garments. A blackness came before their eyes, and it seemed to them in the moment of silence that the world stood still. But their hearts were dead, and their last hope gone. Pippin, who stood behind Prince Imrahil, sprang forward with a cry of grief.
Silence!
Said Gandalf sternly, thrusting him back. But the messenger laughed aloud.
So you have another of these imps with you.
He cried.
What use you find them I cannot guess, but to send them as spies into Mordor is beyond even your accustomed folly. Still, I thank him, for it is plain that this brat at least has seen these tokens before, and it would be vain for you to deny them now.
I do not wish to deny them.
Said Gandalf.
Indeed, I know them all and all their history, despite your scorn, foul mouth of Sauron. You cannot say as much. But why do you bring them here?
Dwarf coat, elf cloak, blade from the down-fallen west, and spy from the little ratland of the Shire. Nay, do not start. We know it well. Here are the marks of a conspiracy. Now, maybe he that bore these things was a creature that you would not grieve to lose. And maybe otherwise. Undear to you, perhaps. If so, take swift counsel with what little wit is left to you. For Sauron does not love spies, and what his fate shall be depends now on your choice.
No one answered him, but he saw their faces grey with fear, and the horror in their eyes, and he laughed again, for it seemed to him that his sport went well.
Good, good. He was dear to you, I see. Or else his errand was one that you did not wish to fail. It has. And now he shall endure the slow torment of years, as long and slow as our arts in the great tower can contrive, and never be released, unless maybe when he is chained and broken, so that he may come to you, and you shall see what you have done. This shall surely be, unless you accept my lord's terms.
Name the terms,
said Gandalf steadily. But those nearby saw the anguish in his face, and now he seemed an old and wizened man, crushed, defeated at last. They did not doubt that he would accept.
These are the terms,
said the messenger, and smiled as he eyed them one by one.
The rabble of Gondor and its eluded allies shall withdraw at once beyond the Anduin. First, taking oaths never again to assail Sauron the Great in arms, open or secret. All lands east of Anduin shall be Sauron's forever. Solely. West of the Anduin, as far as the Misty Mountains and the Gap of Rohan, shall be tributary to Mordor. And men there shall bear no weapons, but shall have leave to govern their own affairs. But they shall help to rebuild Isengard, which they have wantonly destroyed. And that shall be Sauron's, and there his lieutenant shall dwell. Not Saruman, but one more worthy of trust.
Looking in the messenger's eyes, they read his thought. He was to be that lieutenant, and gather all that remained of the West under his sway. He would be their tyrant, and they his slaves. But Gandalf said,
This is much to demand for the delivery of one servant. That your master should receive in exchange what he must else fight many a war to gain. Or has the field of Gondor destroyed his hope in war so that he falls to haggling? And if indeed we rated this prisoner so high, what surety have we that Sauron, the base master of treachery, will keep his part? Where is the prisoner? Let him be brought forth and yielded to us, and then we will consider these demands.
It seemed then to Gandalf, intent, watching him as a man engaged in fencing with a deadly foe, that for the taking of breath the messenger was at a loss. Yet swiftly he laughed.
Do not brandy words in your insolence with the mouth of Sauron. Surety you crave. Sauron gives none. If you sue for his clemency, you must first do his bidding. These are his terms. Take them or leave them.
These we will take,
said Gandalf suddenly. He cast aside his cloak, and a white light shone forth like a sword in that black place. Before his upraised hand the foul messenger recoiled, and Gandalf coming seized and took from him the tokens, coat, cloak, and sword.
These we will take in memory of our friend,
he cried.
But as for your terms, we reject them utterly. Get you gone, for your embassy is over, and death is near to you. We did not come here to waste words in treating with Sauron, faithless and accursed, still less with one of his slaves. Be gone!
Then the messenger of Mordor laughed no more. His face was twisted with amazement and anger to the likeness of some wild beast that, as it crouches on its prey, is smitten on the muzzle with the stinging rod. Rage filled him, and his mouth slavered, and shapeless sounds of fury came strangling from his throat. But he looked at the fell faces of the captains and their deadly eyes, and fear overcame his wrath. He gave a great cry, and turned, leapt upon his steed, and with his company galloped madly back to Cirith Gorgor. But as they went, his soldiers blew their horns in signal long arranged, and even before they came to his gate, Sauron sprang his trap. Drums rolled and fires leapt up. The great doors of the black gate swung back wide. Out of it streamed the great host, as swiftly as swirling waters when a sluice is lifted. The captains mounted again and rode back, and from the host of Mordor there went up a jeering yell. Dust rose, smothering the air, as from nearby there marched up an army of Easterlings that had waited for the signal in the shadows of Ered Lithwi beyond the further tower. Down from the hills on either side of the Morannon poured orcs innumerable. The men of the west were trapped, and soon, all about the grey mounds where they stood, forces 10 times and more than 10 times their match would ring them in a sea of enemies. Sauron had taken the proffered bait in jaws of steel. Little time was left to Aragorn for the ordering of his battle. Upon the one hill he stood with Gandalf, and there fair and desperate was raised the banner of the tree and stars. Upon the other hill hard by stood the banners of Rohan and Dol Amroth, White Horse and Silver Swan. And about each hill a ring was made facing all ways, bristling with spear and sword. But in the front towards Mordor, where the first bitter assault would come, there stood the sons of Elrond, and on the left with the Dunedain about them, and on the right the Prince Imrahil with the men of Dol Amroth, tall and fair, and picked men of the Tower of Guard. The wind blew, and the trumpets sang, and arrows whined, but the sun, now climbing towards the south, was veiled in the reeks of Mordor. And the ending of the day, or the end maybe of all the world of light. And out of the gathering murk, the Nazgul came in, their cold voices crying words of death, and then all hope was quenched. Pippin had bowed, crushed with horror, when he heard Gandalf reject the terms and doom Frodo to the torment of the tower. But he had mastered himself, and now he stood beside Baragond in the front rank of Gondor, with Imrahil's men. For it seemed best to him to die, and soon, and leave the bitter story of his life, since all was in ruin.
Oh, I wish Mary was here.
He heard himself saying, and quick thoughts raced through his mind, even as he watched the enemy come charging into the assault.
Well, now at any rate I understand poor Denethor a little better. We might die together, Mary and I. Since die we must. Why not? Well, as he is not here, I hope he'll find an easier end. But now I must do my best.
He drew his sword and looked at it, and in the intertwining shapes of red and gold, and the flowing characters of Numenor glinted like fire upon the blade.
This was made for just such an hour.
He thought.
If only I could smite that foul messenger with it. Then almost I should draw level with old Mary. Well, I'll smite some of his beastly brood before the end. I wish I could see cool sunlight and green grass again.
Then, even as he thought these things, the first assault crashed upon them. The orcs, hindered by the mires that lay before the hills, halted and poured their arrows into the defending ranks. But through them there came striding up, roaring like beasts, a great company of hill trolls out of Gorgoroth. Taller and broader than men they were, and they were clad only in close-fitting mesh of horny scales. Or maybe that was their hideous hide. But they bore round bucklers, huge and black, and wielded heavy hammers in their knotted hands. Reckless they sprang upon the pools and waded across, bellowing as they came. Like a storm they broke upon the line of the men of Gondor, and beat upon helm and head and arm and shield as smiths hewing the hot bending iron. At Pippin's side Beregond was stunned and overborne, and he fell, and the great troll chief that smote him down bent over him, reaching out a clutching claw, for these fell creatures would bite the throats of those that they threw down. Then Pippin stabbed upwards, and the written blade of Westerness pierced through the hide and went deep into the vitals of the troll, and his black blood came gushing out. He toppled forward and came crashing down like a falling rock, burying those beneath him. Blackness and stench and crushing pain came upon Pippin, and his mind fell away into a great darkness.
So it ends as I guessed it would,
his thoughts said, even as it fluttered away, and it laughed a little within him ere it fled. Almost gay it seemed to be casting off at last all doubt and care and fear. And then, even as it whinged away into forgetfulness, it heard voices, and they seemed to be crying in some forgotten world far above. For one moment more, Pippin's heart hovered.
Bilbo,
It said.
But no. That came in his tale long, long ago. This is my tale. And it is ended now. Goodbye.
And his thought fled far away, and his eyes saw no more. Sam roused himself painfully from the ground. For a moment he wondered where he was, and then all the misery and despair returned to him. He was in the deep dark outside the undergate of the Orcs' stronghold. Its brazen doors were shut. He must have fallen stunned when he hurled himself against them, but how long he had lain there he did not know. Then he had been on fire, desperate and furious. Now he was shivering and cold. He crept to the doors and pressed his ears against them. Far within he could hear faintly the voices of orcs clamoring, but soon they stopped or passed out of hearing, and all was still. His head ached and his eyes saw phantom lights in the darkness, but he struggled to steady himself and think. It was clear at any rate that he had no hope of getting into the orc hold by that gate. He might wait there for days before it was opened. And he could not wait. Time was desperately precious. He no longer had any doubt about his duty. He must rescue his master, or perish in the attempt.
Perishing is more likely and will be a lot easier anyway,
he said grimly to himself, as he sheathed Sting and turned from the brazen doors. Slowly he groped his way back in the dark along the tunnel, not daring to use the elven light, and as he went he tried to fit together the events since Frodo and Heel had left the crossroads. He wondered what the time was. Somewhere between one day and the next, he supposed, but even of the days he had quite lost count. He was in a land of darkness, where the days of the world seemed forgotten, and where all who entered were forgotten too.
I wonder if they think of us at all,
he said.
And what is happening to them all the way there?
He waved his hand vaguely in the air before him, but he was in fact now facing southwards, as he came back to Shelob's tunnel, not west. Out westward in the world it was drawing to noon upon the 14th day of March in the Shire reckoning, and even now Aragorn was leading the Black Fleet from Pelargir, and Merry was riding with the Rohirrim down the Stonewain Valley, while in Minas Tirith flames were rising and Pippin watched the madness growing in the eyes of Denethor. Yet amid all their cares and fear, the thoughts of their friends turned constantly to Frodo and Sam. They were not forgotten, but they were beyond aid, and no thought could yet bring any help to Samwise Hamfast's son. He was utterly alone. He came back at last to the stone door of the Orc Passage, and still unable to discover the catch or bolt that held it, he scrambled over as before and dropped softly to the ground. Then he made his way stealthily to the outlet of Shelob's tunnel, where the rags of her great web were still blowing and swaying in the cold airs. For cold they seemed to Sam after the noisome darkness behind, but the breath of them revived him. He crept cautiously out. All was ominously quiet. The light was no more than that of dusk at a dark day's end. The vast vapours that arose in Mordor and went streaming westward passed low overhead. A great welter of cloud and smoke now lit again beneath with a sullen glow of red. Sam looked up towards the Orc Tower, and suddenly from its narrow windows light stared out like small red eyes. He wondered if they were some signal. His fear of the orcs, forgotten for a while in his wrath and desperation, now returned. As far as he could see, there was only one possible course for him to take. He must go on and try to find the main entrance to the dreadful tower. But his knees felt weak, and he found that he was trembling. Drawing his eyes down from the tower and the horns of the cleft before him, he forced his unwilling feet to obey him, and slowly, listening with all his ears, peering into the dense shadows of the rocks beside the way, he retraced his steps, past the place where Frodo fell, and still the stench of Shelob lingered. And then on and up, until he stood again in the very cleft where he had put on the ring, and seen Shagrat's company go by. There he halted and sat down. For the moment he could drive himself no further. He felt that if once he went beyond the crown of the pass and took one step veritably down into the land of Mordor, that step would be irrevocable. He could never come back. Without any clear purpose he drew the ring and put it on again. Immediately he felt the great burden of its weight, and felt afresh, but now more strong and urgent than ever, the malice of the Eye of Mordor, searching, trying to pierce the shadows that it had made for its own defense, but which now hindered it in its unquiet and doubt. As before, Sam found that his hearing was sharpened, but that to his sight the things of this world seemed thin and vague. The rocky walls of the path were pale, as if seen through a mist, but still at a distance he heard the bubbling of Shelob in her misery. And harsh and clear, and very close it seemed, he heard cries, and the clash of metal. He sprang to his feet, and pressed himself against the wall beside the road. He was glad of the ring, for here was yet another company of orcs on the march, or so at first he thought. Then suddenly he realized that it was not so. His hearing had deceived him. The orc cries came from the tower, whose topmost horn was now right above him, on the left hand of the cleft. Sam shuddered and tried to force himself to move. There was plainly some devilry going on. Perhaps in spite of all orders of the cruelty of the orcs had mastered them, and they were tormenting Frodo, or even savagely hacking him to pieces. He listened, and as he did, a gleam of hope came to him. There could not be much doubt. There was fighting in the tower. The orcs must be at war amongst themselves. Shagrat and Gorbag had come to blows. Faint as was the hope that his guest brought him, it was enough to rouse him. There might just be a chance. His love for Frodo rose above all other thoughts, and forgetting his peril, he cried aloud.
Coming, Mr. Frodo!
He ran forward to the climbing path and over it. At once the road turned left and plunged steeply down. Sam had crossed into Mordor. He took off the ring, moved it maybe by some steep premonition of danger, though to himself he thought only that he wished to see more clearly.
Better to have a look at the worst,
He muttered.
no good blundering about in a fog.
Hard and cruel and bitter was the land that met his gaze. Before his feet, the highest ridge of the Efelduaths fell steeply in great cliffs down into a dark trough, on the further side of which there rose another bridge, much lower, its edge notched and jagged, with crags like fangs that stood out black against the red light behind them. It was the grim Morgai, the inner ring of the fences of the land. Far beyond it, but almost straight ahead, across a wide lake of darkness dotted with tiny fires, there was a great burning glow, and from it rose in huge columns a swirling smoke, dusty red at the roots, black above where it merged into the billowing canopy that roofed in all the accursed land. Sam was looking at Orodruin, the mountain of fire. Ever and anon the furnaces far below its ashen cone would grow hot, and with a great surging and throbbing pour forth rivers of molten rock from chasms in its sides. Some would flow blazing towards Barad-dûr down great channels, some would wind their way into the stony plain, until they cooled and lay like twisted dragon shapes vomited from the tormented earth. In such an hour of labor, Sam beheld Mount Doom, and the light of it, cut off by the high screen of the Efelduath from those who climbed up the path from the west, now glared against the stark rock faces, so that they seemed to be drenched with blood. In that dreadful light Sam stood aghast for now. Looking to his left, he could see the tower of Cirith Ungol in all its strength. The horn that he had seen from the other side was only its topmost turret. Its eastern face stood up in 3 great tiers from a shelf in the mountain wall far below. Its back was to a great cliff behind, from which it jutted out in pointed bastions, one above the other, diminishing as they rose, with sheer sides of cunning masonry that looked northeast and southeast. About the lowest tier, 200 feet below where Sam now stood, there was a battlemented wall enclosing a narrow court. Its gate, upon the near southeastern side, opened to a broad road, the outer parapet of which ran upon the brink of a precipice until it turned southward and went winding down into the darkness to join the road that came over the Morgul Pass. Then on it went through a jagged rift in the Morgai, out into the valley of Gorgoroth and away to Barad-dûr. The narrow upper way on which Sam stood leapt swiftly down by stair and steep path to meet the main road under the frowning walls, close to the tower gate. As he gazed at it, suddenly Sam understood, almost with a shock, that this stronghold had been built not to keep enemies out of Mordor, but to keep them in. It was indeed one of the works of Gondor long ago, in an eastern outpost of the defences of Ithilien, made when, after the last alliance, men of Westerness kept watch on the evil land of Sauron, where his creatures still lurked. But as with Narhos and Karhost, the Towers of the Teeth, so here too the vigilance had failed, and treachery had yielded up the tower to the Lord of the Ringwraiths. And now for long years it had been held by evil things. Since his return to Mordor, Sauron had found it useful, for he had few servants but many slaves of fear. And still its chief purpose as of old was to prevent escape from Mordor. though if an enemy was so rash as to try to enter that land secretly, then it was also a last unsleeping guard against any that might pass the vigilance of Morgul and of Shelob. Only too clearly Sam saw how hopeless it would be for him to creep down under those many-eyed walls and pass the watchful gate. And even if he did so, he could not go far on the guarded road beyond. Not even the black shadows lying deep where the red glow could not reach him would shield him long from the night-eyed orcs. But desperate as that road might be, his task was now far worse. Not to avoid the gate and escape, but to enter it alone. His thought turned to the ring, but there was no comfort there, only dread and danger. No sooner had he come in sight of Mount Doom, burning far away, than he was aware of a change in his burden. As it drew near the great furnaces where, in the deeps of time, it had been shaped and forged, the ring's power grew, and it became more fell, untamable save by some mighty will. As Sam stood there, even though the ring was not on him but hanging by its chain about his neck, he felt himself enlarged, as if he were robed in a huge distorted shadow of himself. A vast and ominous threat halted upon the walls of Mordor. He felt that he had from now on only two choices: to forbear the ring, though it would torment him, or to claim it, and challenge the power that sat in its dark hold beyond the Valley of Shadows. Already the ring tempted him, gnawing at his will and reason. Wild fantasies arose in his mind, and he saw Samwise the Strong, hero of the age, striding with the flaming sword across the darkened land, and armies flocking to his call as he marched to the overthrow of Barad-dûr. And then all the clouds rolled away, and the white sun shone, and at his command the Vale of Gorgoroth became a garden of flowers and trees, and brought forth fruit. He had only to put on the ring, and claim it for his own, and all this could be. In that hour of trial it was the love of his master that helped most to hold him firm. But also deep down in him lived still unconquered his plain hobbit sense. He knew in the core of his heart that he was not large enough to bear such a burden, even if such visions were not a mere cheat to betray him. The one small garden of a free gardener was all he needed and do. Not a garden swollen to a realm, but his own hands to use, not the hands of others to command.
And anyway, all these notions are only a trick,
he said to himself.
He'd spot me and cow me before I could so much as shout out. He'd spot me pretty quick if I put the ring on now. And Mordor, well, all I can say is, things look as hopeless as a frost in spring. Just when being invisible would really be useful, I can't use the ring. If I ever get any further, it's going to be nothing but a drag and a burden every step. So what's to be done?
He was not really in any doubt. He knew that he must go down to the gate, and not linger any more. With a shrug of his shoulders, as if to shake off the shadow and dismiss the phantoms, he began slowly to descend. With each step he seemed to diminish. He had not gone far before he had shrunk again to a very small and frightened hobbit. He was now passing under the very walls of the tower, and the cries and sounds of fighting could be heard with his unaided ears. At the moment the noise seemed to be coming from the court behind the outer wall. Sam was about halfway down the path, when out of the dark gateway into the red glow there came two orcs running. They did not turn towards him. They were making for the main road, but even as they ran, they stumbled and fell to the ground and lay still. Sam had seen no arrows, but he guessed that the orcs had been shot down by others on the battlement or hidden in the shadows of the gate. He went on, hugging the wall to his left. One look upward had shown him that there was no hope of climbing it. The stonework rose 30 feet without a crack or ledge to overhanging courses like inverted steps. The gate was the only way. He crept on, and as he went, he wondered how many orcs lived in the tower with Shagrat, and how many Gorbag had, and what they were quarreling about, if that was what was happening. Shagrat's companies had seemed to be about 40, and Gorbag's more than twice as large, But of course Shagrad's patrol had only been a part of his garrison. Almost certainly they were quarreling about Frodo and the spoil, for suddenly things seemed clear to him, almost as if he had seen them with his eyes. The mithril coat. Of course, Frodo was wearing it, and they would find it, and from what Sam had heard, Gorbag would covet it. But the orders of the Dark Tower were at present Frodo's only protection, and if they were set aside, Frodo might be killed out of hand at any moment.
Come on.
Sam cried to himself.
Now for it!
He drew Sting and ran towards the open gate, but just as he was about to pass under its great arch, he felt a shock, as if he had run into some web like Shelobs, only invisible. He could see no obstacle, but something too strong for his will to overcome barred the way. He looked about, and then within the shadow of the gate, he saw the two watchers. They were like great figures seated upon thrones. Each had 3 joined bodies, and 3 heads facing outward and inward, and across the gateway. The heads had vulture faces, and on their great knees were laid claw-like hands. They seemed to be carved out of huge blocks of stone, immovable, and yet they were aware. Some dreadful spirit of evil vigilance abode in them. They knew an enemy. Visible or invisible, none could pass unheeded. They would forbid his entry, or his escape. Hardening his will, Sam thrust forward once again and halted with a jerk, staggering as if from a blow upon his breast and head. Then, greatly daring, because he could think of nothing else to do, answering a sudden thought that came to him, he drew slowly out the file of Galadriel and held it up. Its white light quickened swiftly, and the shadows under the dark arch fled. The monstrous watchers sat there cold and still, revealed in all their hideous shape. For a moment Sam caught a glitter in the black stones of their eyes, the very malice of which made him quail. But slowly he felt their will waver and crumble into fear. He sprang past them, but even as he did so, thrusting the file back into his bosom, he was aware, as plainly as if a bar of steel had snapped to behind him, that their vigilance was renewed, and from those evil heads there came a high, shrill cry in the towering walls before him. Far up above, like an answering signal, a harsh bell clanged a single stroke.
That's done it,
Said Sam.
Now I've rung the front door bell. Well, come on, somebody!
He cried.
Tell Captain Shagrad that the great elf warrior has called, and with his elf sword too!
There was no answer. Sam strode forward, Sting glittered blue in his hand. The courtyard lay in deep shadow, but he could see that the pavement was strewn with bodies. Right at his feet were 2 orc archers with knives sticking in their backs. Beyond lay many more shapes, some singly as they had been hewn down or shot, others in pairs, still grappling one another, dead in the very throes of stabbing, throttling, biting. The stones were slippery with dark blood. 2 liveries Sam noticed, one marked by the red eye, the other by a moon disfigured with a ghastly face of death. But he did not stop to look more closely. Across the court, a great door at the foot of the tower stood half open, and a red light came through. A large orc lay dead upon the threshold. Sam sprang over the body and went in, and then he peered about at a loss. A wide and echoing passage led back from the door towards the mountainside. It was dimly lit with torches flaring in the brackets on the walls, but its distant end was lost in gloom. Many doors and openings could be seen on this side and that, but it was empty save for 2 or 3 more bodies sprawling on the floor. From what he had heard of the captain's talk, Sam knew that, dead or alive, Frodo would most likely be found in a chamber high up in the turret far above. But he might search for a day before he found the way.
It'll be near the back, I guess.
Sam muttered.
The whole tower climbs backwards like. And anyway, I'll better follow these lights.
He advanced down the passage, but slowly now, each step more reluctant. Terror was beginning to grip him again. There was no sound save the rap of his feet, which seemed to grow in an echoing noise, like the slapping of great hands upon the stones. The dead bodies, the emptiness, the dank black walls that in the torchlight seemed to drip with blood, the fear of sudden death lurking in doorway or shadow, and behind all his mind, the waiting, watchful malice at the gate. It was almost more than he could screw himself to face. He would have welcomed a fight, with not too many enemies at the time, rather than this hideous, brooding uncertainty. He forced himself to think of Frodo, lying bound or in pain or dead somewhere in his dreadful place. He went on. He had passed beyond the torchlight, almost to a great arched door at the end of the passage, the inner side of the undergate, as he rightly guessed, when there came, from high above, a dreadful choking shriek. He stopped short. Then he heard feet coming. Someone was running in great haste down an echoing stairway overhead. His will was too weak and too slow to restrain his hand. It dragged at the chain and clutched the ring, but Sam did not put it on. For even as he clasped it to his breast, an orc came clattering down, leaping down from a dark opening at the right. It ran towards him. It was no more than 6 paces from him when, lifting its head, it saw him, and Sam could hear its gasping breath and see the glare in its bloodshot eyes. It stopped short aghast. For what it saw was not a small frightened hobbit trying to hold a steady sword. It saw a great silent shape, cloaked in a grey shadow, looming against the wavering light behind. In one hand it held a sword, the very light of which was a bitter pain. The other was clutched at its breast, but held concealed some nameless menace of power and doom. For a moment the orc crouched, and then with a hideous yelp of fear it turned and fled back as it had come. Never was any dog more heartened when its enemy turned tail than Sam at this unexpected flight. With a shout, he gave chase.
The elf warrior is loose!
He cried,
I'm coming! Just you show me the way up or I'll skin you!
but the orc was in its own haunts, nimble and well-fed. Sam was a stranger, hungry and wary. The stairs were high and steep and winding. Sam's breath began to come in gasps. The orc had soon passed out of sight, and only faintly could be heard the slapping of its feet as it went on and up. Every now and again it gave a yell, and the echo ran along the walls. But slowly, all sound of it died away. Sam plodded on. He felt that he was on the right road, and his spirits had risen a good deal. He thrust the ring away and tightened his belt.
Well,
He said,
if only